with Lions season right around the corner, I implore everybody, if you could take a little bit of time, 2-3 days, take that time off, because y'all know how Lions season is around here, behind the scenes and in front of the camera. And shout out to this elite booth too. We got Kavasi Chase in the sound booth, JB Smooth in the TD booth, intern Ryan's in the building, and Flannel Sam, Jaire Alexander. We discussed this, and JB Smooth dropped some of those truth bombs that we were discussing. We were thinking, hey, the price might be this. This is something that, hey, it would be cool if the Lions looked this way. You even thought that this was something that maybe the Lions got to take a look at.
Well, and I completely overshot probably what it would have taken to get Jaire Alexander.
Based on what it took and based on what you're saying, I'm like, can we run this back real quick? Can I go back and agree?
Well, to be fair, I think that Jaire Alexander wanted to be in Baltimore. He's college teammates with Lamar Jackson. And obviously, Baltimore,
I get it.
That's a good situation. You know that if you go to the Ravens, you're going to get a chance to play for the Super Bowl because the Ravens are always good. I think they've earned the respect. Is in the regular season, you can pretty much pencil in 11, 12 wins, an MVP caliber season from Lamar Jackson, good defense that's well coached, a secondary with a lot of talented players. I definitely understand why he did that. However, the contract, 1 year, $4 million with a potential $2 million in playing time incentives. I'm quite frankly shocked that he took a contract that low, but our very own JB Smooth had a take on it. If you want to go ahead and play that and then respond to your take.
Yep. Well, deal's done. It's in the books. Jaire Alexander signs with the Ravens, just giving him more ammunition to have a playoff run this season as well too. 1 year, $4 million with $2 million in incentives. So he's making upwards of $6 million just off of a 1 year deal. When hell, us on Waker Woodward, we're talking about him getting, 15, 16? Hell, Flannel wanted to go to 20. But 1 year, we couldn't have offered that. We couldn't have offered that or something a little bit more. And I know he wants to sit here and play with his old college teammate in Lamar Jackson, which is cool. That's fine. But come on. The Lions are on the rise. I would have at least kicked the tires on this. Brad, you can't tell me that you didn't at least try and offer something. Please, just let me know to ease my mind.
Goodness. Look, JB Smooth, I got to go over to you first, man, as a voice of reason, because this wasn't just a reaction video. This felt like personal, man. Talk to me, bro.
It was a little personal just because we were talking about it earlier last week, and I'm just going back thinking like, yeah, our crazy predictions of what we thought he'd want in a contract was just like, all right, outrageous, man. Maybe that's something Brad doesn't want to do. But to sit here and see him sign a 1 year deal with the Ravens and take less money than what we all projected, what probably other sports analysts projected as well, too, it's crazy just to sit here and play with Lamar Jackson. Now, obviously, I think he sees something in the Ravens right now that he wants to help this team along with. I don't know how long he'll be playing for them, how much time he'll get on the field, but at the same time, he sees the Ravens on the rise as well, too. And I believe we play the Ravens this season as well, too.
Yeah,
so we are going to have to see this man once again. And honestly, I would like it to be on our side if he was going to be playing still. It should have been on our side. Brad loves these 1 year prove it deals. This is a perfect example of a 1 year prove it deal.
Too?
A perfect example.
Goodness.
This was
sundress
right
season for Brad Holmes. This was absolute sundress. Like when I saw the amount, I was like, you know what? Maybe Flannel was on to something. Obviously, the context matters, but money still talks. Opportunity is still talks. It's not as if the Detroit Lions are some barren situation that wouldn't have been able to present a Super Bowl expectant season to Jaire and a little bit more money, probably a lot more money, especially when we were talking about what they had available, what you would probably do to shore up, and not just shore up. You're talking about pushing the secondary well beyond what I already believe is elite. I'm expecting some steps up from guys like Terry and Arnold, and I thought Jaire Alexander could have been a guy that provided a little bit more than depth for this secondary. I don't want to take away from a TA in this situation because that was a little bit of what we were talking about before. But when you're talking about that type of money, it's like, could $10 million, could $10 million have convinced him to come to Detroit and try and win a Super Bowl here rather than going to Baltimore with, You know, an old friend and teammate.
Hell, I'll give you 8 right now.
What did you say?
I said, hell, I'll give you 8 right now plus a meal and incentives if it helps. Like, come on.
Could have sprinkled, or was this one that was just like? I think it's this. I believe it's what you've been saying all along, and what we've been saying all along. No matter what we think, no matter what we believe, Brad Holmes really believes he's cooking. Brad Holmes, I think he believes in the secondary just as much as he's talking about he believes in the defensive line. And that's where I do believe when you hear him say, yeah, our defensive line room is set. I actually believe he thinks that. I really do.
Yeah.
He's been very honest throughout this process, and when you look at the secondary, they have made a lot of investments there, and that to me is where, when we're looking from the outside of their room looking in, we see what we see, and we believe, hey, they need these things to be able to get to Super Bowl contention. But Brad Holmes throughout this process has been stoically petty. Yeah. And stubborn to his own path, and who can question that with the results and the success they've had. Even when they got decimated, they still found ways to get to 15-2 and gave themselves a great shot at the postseason.
And here's the thing, and this is where I think me and the chat will never ever kumbaya whatsoever. And this is not even just for this particular case. It's a philosophical thing. If you want to harp on Jaire Alexander's injuries, because I said it the last time we talked about him. 3 out of the last 4 seasons, he's had his season cut very short by injuries, like played less than half. That's a problem. That's obviously something that – it's funny because Brad Holmes, I don't think he really does look at that too much, but I get it if you're turned off by that. However, one thing that this fan base does more than anything is prop up our role players and denigrate other team stars, acting like he's a bum. We don't need him. What are you talking about? I even saw Doughboy Steve say that he's a loser, and it's like,
he was a Packer. He was. They all are.
Fair.
He was a Packer.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fine.
No,
but
I salute you, Jaire Alexander.
No, and I'm not mad at Brad Holmes either. I'm not like, why didn't you make this move? This is the reason why they're not going to win a Super Bowl is because they didn't get Jaire Alexander. No, but I'll tell you what. Do I believe this is the type of move that could put the Ravens over the top? You bet your ass I do. I'm not picking them to win the Super Bowl. I ultimately think that they'll probably flame out in the playoffs.
But
like
in a Ravens defense, you don't want more weapons in their secondary at all. You don't want any more weapons on the Ravens. We already understand how they roll. We understand how Harbaugh pushes them. We understand what this defense has been historically. It doesn't matter who they churn out on that roster. We know how they're showing out and showing up. And that's where, when you're talking about Super Bowl expectations, that's absolutely fair. We talked about the teams in the NFC that we didn't want to be able to get a hold of some of the players that might be available. We were like, yo, if some of these guys are available, we want to be the ones to also be in the mix, because could you imagine if Myles Garrett was getting traded and it was to one of these other NFC teams? Could you imagine if Taylor Hendrickson was actually getting traded and it was like the Commanders? And you continue to pose certain scenarios that was like, man, you know what? Even if this isn't a need of ours, do you really want to have to go up against that? Especially now, think about the fact that you're looking at Frank Ragnar retiring. Can you imagine if one of these other pass rushers went and our defensive line is getting just a little bit weaker? That would be a horrible compounding of situations there. And so when you're talking about this thing at the Super Bowl level, I do believe it's fair to look at what are your potential Super Bowl matchups. What are these guys doing to position themselves to try and win a Super Bowl? And if the Ravens are still making moves, which before they did this move, people would have said that they're already Super Bowl contenders. After they make the move, all people will be able to look at it and say is they're trying to do things to make sure they can push those chances up and give themselves greater chances than they probably had prior. And that's where I absolutely I'm in lockstep with you. I trust in Brad, and I do believe that Brad believes in what he has. I believe in TA. I'm waiting to see what Ennis Rakestraw has, but I'm going to give him some, the chance to prove himself. I believe in some of the additions they've made. And then obviously that safety tandem back there. But this is where I do understand when you look at what some of these other teams are doing. We talked about teams that are winning championships all over the other sports, realms, from hockey and baseball and all this other stuff and basketball. And we're looking at the moves that they're doing. They already were contenders. They were already teams that were going to be able to get somewhere, but they still went and made that extra move. And even we hear the Tigers saying the same thing. Scott Harris didn't say, oh, we're not World Series contenders as is. He said, no, we're World Series contenders. But because we are, that's making us more aggressive at our trade deadline approach. And so from that perspective, I kind of get what you're saying. If you could find a way to get players like that, that was a layup, man. If you're talking about you might have a handshake deal with Big Z, and you could have gotten potentially a player of Jaire's caliber to help push you over the top. Not that they're not already Super Bowl caliber.
Well, and this is where I have to say this as well. And this is just my prediction. And this doesn't mean that the Ravens are going to win the Super Bowl, that I'm picking them to win it, because quite frankly, I probably still won't, because there's too many questions to me about Lamar Jackson in the playoffs, but that's another conversation for another day. I do think that Jaire Alexander at 1 year, $4 million, low risk, $6 million with incentives is going to be one of the best and most valuable contracts in the NFL. And quite frankly, I'm surprised that Jaire Alexander took it. I think that this tells you something about who he is as a person, who he is as a player, and maybe he's looking at himself in the mirror a bit. Because all I ever hear about is he's a diva, he's a cancer, he didn't accept a pay cut from the Packers, makes him a bad guy and whatnot. But this tells me that Jaire Alexander understands that if he balls out, if he plays under this cheap contract, if he has a great year, if he stays healthy and the Ravens make a deep playoff run, that this is his chance to get a bigger payday after the season. I think this shows that Jaire Alexander values winning. I think it shows that he values relationships. And I understand when you're friends with Lamar Jackson, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, it makes it easier. But I think he probably could have got more somewhere else. But Jaire Alexander is smart. I think he's being savvy. I think he's going to a situation that will really benefit him. And that Ravens secondary next year, and JB, I put something in that about that in Slack, what it could potentially look like in December, because one of their safeties looks like he's going to be out till December. And this is, come playoff time, what it could look like. Cornerback Nate Wiggins, strong safety Kyle Hamilton. We know the type of star that he is. Free safety Ardarius Washington, who is probably going to be out till December, but they expect him back. He was the eighth ranked PFF safety last year. Cornerback Jaire Alexander, who's a two-time All-Pro, last one being in 2022. And then sliding over to play more of the nickel role would be a Marlon Humphrey, who was a two-time All-Pro, including last year was an All-Pro. That's the type of power move that makes this secondary, if this secondary can stay healthy, and you even include rotational pieces like rookie Malachi Starks and a guy like Chidobe Awuzie, that to me is the best secondary in football. Ardarius Washington, it's a little iffy because he's coming from back from an Achilles and they don't expect him back till December. But come playoff time, if they can keep this intact, adding Jaire Alexander, it's formidable. It'll be not Legion of Boom, because I don't think we'll ever see a secondary quite like that again. They were so dominant. But best secondary in the NFL, absolutely. And that's why the Ravens did it. They got an opportunity to get somebody who could be like a star for very, very cheap.
Yeah, definitely.
Because he's depreciated.
And it's an interesting thing because we consider our Detroit Lions in the same era of these teams, while meanwhile we look at the national landscape and they're not. Other than like Mark Schlereth and one of his other co-host panelists who's a Chicago Bears fan, so he's not going to really stoke the beast as it relates to the Lions, who've punched them in the nose over and over and over again. There's nobody else who I'm seeing that's saying, hey, yeah, you know what? The Lions, they're Super Bowl contenders. The Lions are on the same level as these other teams we believe are going to win. So they're not even giving them that in the NFC. They're everyone is just push button saying it's definitely the Eagles, so they won the Super Bowl, definitely the upstart Commanders. And then there's other teams who wonder if it's going to be a struggle for the Lions themselves in their own NFC North division. So that to me is why it does matter. When you see other teams who have these pedigrees making these types of moves, who have gone on playoff runs, who have won Super Bowls, maybe not some of these players, but some of those teams have, and these organizations, they know what they're doing. And if we're not careful, those Lions get passed up quick. We saw how quickly the Lions passed up teams because they did do a lot of good things right, and they took a lot of chances and risks early on, especially with some young players. But that's where I still continue to go back to this aspect of, I see what these other good teams are doing, but I'm still giving some time to Brad Holmes, who sometimes it feels like he's been here for 20 years with how good he's doing things, how much this Lions team has already succeeded, seeing the only 2 division banners hanging up in Ford Field right now. And so that's the other component of it where I'm just like, you know what? I do believe that Brad Holmes is one of those guys who can do it his own way, but this is going to be that biggest year, the biggest season, obviously, because this is the one that culminates in you're going to rely on draft picks. You're trying to rely on keeping this thing together. You're trying to rely on you're handing out now big contracts. These weren't things that he had to deal with at the beginning of it. Now he's having to deal with it. And I do believe the Lions, me personally, I believe that they are Super Bowl contenders. I believe that they still are NFC contenders and that they're going to show out quite well. This is just a situation where I do believe a guy like a Zadarius Smith, a guy, someone else to help either in the linebackers or along the offensive line, something like that. These things do help the Lions as it relates to a Super Bowl for sure.
And this is all that we're talking about, and I'm been consistent about this. I think Jaire Alexander would come in to the Lions and be the best corner on the team.
You've been consistent about that.
I'm not as concerned with diminishing Terrion's role a little bit, although I think he could be a really valuable rotational piece. Although we know it's not going to happen, he's going to be the starter. But Cody Ingle, again, I feel like we agree on almost nothing when it comes to the Lions. When I was talking about the Ravens and how it could be the best secondary, he puts "could be" in quotes. Here's the problem with that. Kyle Hamilton and Marlon Humphrey were first-team All-Pros last year. Nate Wiggins, whether you like it or not, put up better numbers from the cornerback position as a rookie than Terrion Arnold did. Jaire Alexander has been an All-Pro when he's been healthy. But at the very, very least, you know the type of player Kyle Hamilton is. You know the type of player Marlon Humphrey is and still is, or was and still is. There's a lot of knowns. There's a few question marks, like Ardarius Washington's injury. I get that. Malachi Starks is a rookie. I understand that completely, but it's not just like there's a lot of ifs that have to happen. There's some knowns. There's a lot of knowns. That Ravens secondary was one of the best in the NFL last year, and they just got some reinforcements.
I see Chuckle Cheese in the chat. I don't see how anybody could think that this team, regardless of the schedule, is going to take too many steps back. They're too good and they're too deep. Well, that's the thing. Everybody that you guys would probably consider to be analysts and experts well above us, they're saying these things. That's what they're saying. The people who believe they're not going to take too far steps back are literally people like Flannel and myself, who believe that this team still has a division ahead of them, who still do believe that this team is going to be major contenders in the NFC and contenders at the Super Bowl level. We've consistently been on the side of that this team, as currently constructed, is Super Bowl level, but we also saw that there's a level beyond. This isn't to me about if this team takes steps back in the regular season. I don't care if they win 11 games and win the division. That's not a step back for me. For me, a step back is when we start to judge them in the playoffs, if this team gets to the Super Bowl or not. And that, to me, is where I believe the mindset has to be. But I continue to give, like no matter how I feel about things should go, I continue to go back to this. I do believe Brad has given himself the ultimate flexibility at the trade deadline because he rolls by this philosophy. We don't know what the needs are going to be. We don't. We looked at the draft, and I wonder how many people, if they knew what Frank Ragnar was going to do, some people who might have thought we need to double up on the defensive line early. I wonder how many people change their perspective on some of these picks on Rutledge once Frank Ragnar retires, and then they understand, because Brad said it. He was like, man, look at all you guys. You guys were talking about the J-Mo pick. And then all of a sudden it became a need, but at a time later than when we drafted him. So it's like I continue to kind of bounce back and forth with that. And where Brad is shown to have this pulse over the team, that's where I'm like, okay, I can breathe a little bit. Because as fans, we all going to have our opinions. Chat going to disagree with us. We're going to disagree with Brad. They're going to disagree with Brad. We might disagree with them. But at the end of the day, I have found this place of where I see some people losing their cool a little bit with Iserman, both chat family, both media people, as well as national people. With Brad Holmes, it's more or less where we're like, you know what? Based on the landscape, this is an opinion we think would work. But I haven't seen anybody who, even with those takes, who haven't still tipped the cap to Brad, except for a few people. I see some in the chat who are still saying they're not going to trust in Brad until he wins a Super Bowl, despite the fact that I believe he has his team firmly in a position to do what they got to do this year.
Trust is different than what I said before, which is I don't think Brad is infallible. Like, if he does, let me just say this. And to really kind of like bring my point home that I've been trying to make pretty much the entire offseason. Yeah. The second the Lions win a Super Bowl, I will never criticize another move Brad Holmes ever makes. Never again. Not once. Again, the shows are probably going to be pretty boring because it's going to be a Lions pep rally all the time, but we'll all love it and have fun.
It's just a Brad Holmes Krispy Kreme.
Absolutely, absolutely. Until then, I will praise almost everything Brad Holmes has done because he deserves it and he's earned it. almost everything. However, that doesn't mean that if I still think right now, if there's something that I disagree with, if there's something that he does that doesn't end up working, you can still be like, man, Brad, as a team that's trying to win a Super Bowl, whose really only gauge of success is going to be if they win a Super Bowl, got to be a little bit better. But overall, most of the time, all in on what Brad Holmes does, and of course, I trust him. I do.
Definitely. I see some people in the chat here. Cody Ingle, yeah, maybe Alexander only wanted to go to Baltimore.
And that's fair.
That is very fair.
That's. I mean, he took peanuts for him. I was willing to give him a lot more than that. Thank you, JB, for throwing me under the bus, but that's okay. Like, I'm responsible for everything I say on the air, and
we all
shout out to you.
We'll read a couple more of these before we say what up, though, to some friends, because, guys, trust me, we're going to throw that phone number out there, and we want you guys to be able to call on both or all of these topics. Who you think the Tigers' locks are? Flannel only believes in schools. He didn't even put Riley Green there. Obviously, this segment here, we're talking about Brad Holmes, the Lions. I want to know, I want you guys to say it with your chest, how confident you are that the Detroit Lions are Super Bowl contenders this year, that they will find themselves playing for Vince Lombardi's trophy. But I see DC Big also in the chat. He says, Kool-Aid should feel some fear about the Lions situation. They will take a step back or two just because of the changes in the coaching staff. I mean, so there's still some people who do believe we should have some fears, but I've seen this team battle and go through so much adversity, whether it be injuries to stars, injury to your depth, injury to your whole defense. I've seen this team go from, we were questioning. I remember asking this in the beginning of the Lions season, do the Lions have the best safety tandem in the NFL? And even the chat was like, oh, Kool-Aid, man, you continue to learn ball because that ain't it. And by the end of the season, they got the best safety tandem in the NFL. There are some great things this team has as it relates to overcoming adversity, overcoming the history and the stigma of the Lions. And I love the fact that Dan Campbell called that out. Who was here when we were trash? Yeah, that ain't us no more. Even Jared Goff said, yeah, we understand the connection, but we don't wear that. We're something completely different. And so as I see this team continue to overcome adversity, see this team only continue to win more and more games every year, see this team continue to not lose back-to-back games, win all your division games, win all your road games while you're banged the frick up. That to me is where it's just like, where am I supposed to have this fear? Where am I supposed to have this, the Lions are going to, they're coordinators. Who that Dan Campbell found? I remember what people were talking about Ben Johnson early on. I remember what people were talking about Aaron Glenn, even almost all the way up until the end. Until they started to realize, with all of our defense depleted, he still had this defense. I mean, then people wanted to start to say, oh, shout out to Aaron Glenn. Before that, it was a couple years in a row of a lot of people saying, he ain't him. So it's like, I've seen this team overcome. I've seen this team rise to the occasion. I've seen this team go well beyond the level of what people think they are. We've seen them overcome an injury to Hutch, who was on a absolute, what I thought was going to be a historic tear from the edge position. So that's where my confidence comes from as it relates to not fearing. Like the whole aspect of Stoke not scared, I'm so serious. Until this team falls on its face, you got to at least lose back-to-back games. Bro, listen, I get it. But they haven't lost back-to-back games literally in 2.5 seasons. That's insane to me.
I think the fear honestly comes from, and I'm not saying me, I'm not saying the majority of you, is the fact that the expectations are sky high, and we know that they're not going 15-2. And if they do, you know what? Fine, you can come back to this and say that I was a dumbass. But I think we can all agree that they're not going 15-2. But
no.
Us as Lions fans, we're going to have to accept that. We're going to have to realize that regular season losses on a macro level, as long as they take care of business overall and win the division, do not matter. You might go into Kansas City and lose, for example. The horror. No, you might go into Baltimore and lose. Yeah. The horror.
This is finally the season where I think we ride this season out with Super Bowl expectations no matter what your team does. You know that they're going to wind up with their division title, with their 11 wins, and it'd be an absolute juggernaut in the playoffs. That's what I'm expecting. And I've seen other teams do this. We saw the Chiefs do this. We saw 49ers fans and go through this, and they lost their 3 games in a row, and they were still like, no, we're going to still dog walk y'all. They were telling us this. They were telling us when we were talking about, we're going to get to we can beat them in their home. This was before we had even won the games we needed to win. But it was just crazy seeing these teams and their fans, like even Lindsey, 49ers fan. Just to see how confident these fans are in their teams, because they've done this for some years. And that is where I believe Lions fans should get to. I saw somebody say in the chat, Steve-O, baby, records don't mean ish. I think this is a season where 11, 12 wins, if that's what it comes down to. I'm still predicting 13, but 11, 12 wins, if that's what it comes. I think we brought it down 1 because of Ragnar. But 11, 12 wins, division title, give yourself a great shot in the playoffs. That to me means you did not take a step back until we start to assess what you actually did in the playoffs.
Yep. It's 100%. It's if they win less games, that does not equate to a step back. It's all about what happens in the playoffs, and it's all about this schedule's brutal at times, but I think the Lions will be able to overcome it as unscathed as you possibly can, which means about an 11-6, 12-5 record. But do you know who could help them get that record? The man that everybody says I hate the most, Jameson Williams. But he might be getting.
You bought his jersey.
I did. He might be getting. He might be more of a priority in terms of the future of the Lions than a lot of us may have surmised earlier in the offseason, and a lot of people on Twitter think probably as well. And we're gonna talk about that. And we're gonna play a video clip of a pretty prominent NFL draft Lions